And in other news tonight, a Bristow church is facing tough times after it was forced to move out of its building. Now, we first told you about Assembly of God in January and that it was built on what is now a Superfund site. Dan Bewley went to Bristow and knew at 5:30 the pastor says faith will pull the congregation through this trying time.
This old building has been a grocery store, an upholstery shop, and most recently a bar. But it's being converted into a church and a youth center, all because the church's old building is on top of an old oil dump site. In the heart of downtown Bristow sits one of the city's oldest buildings. Built in 1923, this was originally a hotel.
The last thing that it had been used for was a bar, so there were posters and banners of beer advertisements all over the place.
Mark Evans is pastor of the First Assembly of God. His church has remodeled the old bar, restored the tin ceiling, brought in chairs and musical instruments. He now calls it Brick Street. It's used by the church's youth for worship and meetings. So why would a church take over a bar? Evans says they didn't have much choice after the Department of Environmental Quality put 125 acres of land in Bristow on the Superfund list. It was home to the old Wilcox Oil Company's oil refinery. Last summer, Evans learned his church building's foundation was sitting right on top of toxic soil. He decided to close the building, and his congregation has faced challenges ever since.
There's been times we didn't know how we were going to pay our staff, how we were going to pay the bills.
Evans says the church pays more than $1,100 in rent for this old building and a place to worship at another church in town. In addition, he says his staff had to take a 25% pay cut so they could pay the bills and afford to remodel the old bar. Despite the difficulties, Evans says the church has received a ton of support. Checks from strangers arrive in the mail to pay bills, for example. So he's not worried. He says his faith teaches that good can come from tragedy.
God works all things together for the good. The Bible tells us that. So I think we can rejoice in the midst of what we're going through because we know God's going to work it all out.
Evans says he'd like to have property for the new church within a year and move into the new building within 2 to 3 years. In Bristow, Dan Bewley, News on 6.
Also out of Bristow, city leaders are looking to create what is essentially a virtual fence line around the city. The city council is considering annexing a 25-foot wide, 90-mile-long strip that surrounds Bristow. All of the land inside the strip would be part of Creek County. Mayor Ralph Barnett says the goal is to protect the city's water lines. For example, if the city expands water lines to a rural area outside city limits, the annexation would prevent other water utilities from taking over those lines.
We're not trained to provide annexation. We don't want to. It's still a rural area. So all we're trying to do is to protect the lines that we do put in the ground.
The city is holding a public meeting tomorrow night to talk about the project. It's at Bristow City Hall and starts at 7 p.m.